In the final quarter of 2024, Hegel debuted their new H400 integrated amplifier, built to replace the very popular H390, of which I am a longtime owner. That amp has traditionally been one of the biggest sellers for the Norwegian company, and its popularity gives the H400 a lot to live up to. The question is the new H400 still the gold standard in this very crowded segment? That I aim to find out. There was a time when integrated amplifiers were not really taken seriously in hi-fi. That common notion was still alive when I started in this hobby 12 years ago. But it's kind of been chipped away at ever since. Relentlessly so much, as companies have released high-performance one-box offerings that have come to best a lot of pre and power combos of the past. Integrated amplifier design has come a long way in the last 20 years, and one of the companies leading this charge has been Hegel Music Systems. I don't know if I necessarily need to introduce Hegel to most viewers of this channel. Their market presence has been pretty astounding in the last few years. But the rundown for those of you that have been absent from hi-fi media in the past decade is that Hegel produced solid-state Class A/B integrated amplifiers and separates. Their models are designed in Norway but are manufactured in China, and their styling has always been pretty much as minimal as humanly possible. The technology this company is most known for is their patented sound engine technology, now in its second iteration called Sound Engine 2. This is a feed-forward design making use of analog computers to eliminate time delays that plague traditional negative feedback amplifier designs. All of this is accomplished without any digital processing, which is kind of a topic and a benefit I will get to further along in this review. Hegel's bread and butter is their lineup of integrated amplifiers, which for a few generations now have included a streamer and a DAC alongside the pre and power sections. Their offerings start at the $2,000 H95 model, offering 60 watts per channel, and go up to their newest flagship, the H600, released earlier this year, which offers an oddly specific 303 watts per channel into 8 ohms at an eye-watering price of $12,500 US. This new H400 model that I have beside me is the penultimate model in Hegel's integrated lineup, slotting in just below the H600 and offering a power figure very close to its 303 watts per channel at 250 watts per channel into 8 ohms. However, it's almost half the price of that flagship 600 model at $7,000 US MSRP. It's the predecessor to this model here, the now discontinued H390 that I purchased in 2021. Funny enough, I was actually trying to review the H390 for my previous magazine, but at that time the units were so popular during the height of the COVID pandemic that Hegel had none to send me. So I decided to actually purchase one from a dealer that offered me a discount, with the idea that if after the review, if I didn't like it, I could probably sell it for about what I paid for it. Funny enough, that didn't end up happening, and the state of my system is my reference integrated up through this year. When the Absolute Sound contacted me and asked if I'd be interested in reviewing the new H400, my first thoughts were, how different can this be than the H390? Before we get into what's new under the hood on the H400, I want to give a brief rundown of the specs and functions of this amplifier. If you're familiar with Hegel's integrateds, you'll know right away that the front faceplate and the knobs look identical to pretty much every other Hegel model, both new and old. If you look at the unit from afar, it will look pretty much identical to the H390, and the 44-pound weight is also the same. However, there are some changes you might not notice until you look closely, such as taller feet, a new venting design on the top cover, and a vastly improved volume control. One of my biggest complaints over the course of my H390 ownership was the limp volume control knob, and I'm happy to say that the knob feel on the H400 is worlds better in terms of use and feel. On the H390, I felt like I would have to spin the control knob endlessly to get to my desired playback gain, but this one has a notched volume control that's much more responsive and easy to use. The front knobs are now also push buttons, allowing you to access the setup menu from the front of the unit as well as from the included metal remote. The right knob is now a mute button, which I found incredibly handy for use when using the H400 with vinyl playback. It's much easier to just hit the mute button when dropping the stylus than to readjust the volume every single time I change sides. The rear connectivity and layout is another aspect that looks pretty much unchanged from the H390. If you look, you'll notice most of the connections on the back are digital, with 3 optical and 2 coaxial connections, as well as a USB-B connection and an Ethernet jack. Analog inputs are more limited, with just 2 analog RCA inputs and 1 balanced XLR input. 2 RCA outputs are available. One is a fixed output that is very useful for connecting a dedicated headphone amplifier or other adjustable gain device. The other output is variable, and this is useful if you wish to connect a separate power amplifier and run the H400 as a preamp. Something I was actually able to test in this review, but I'll get to that later. The network connectivity of the H400 is Ethernet only. There is no Wi-Fi capability. Hegel do have a very sound reasoning for this, and that is limiting the connection to wired Ethernet vastly decreases the potential for noise and interference in the signal. If getting a true Ethernet connection to your equipment rack is an absolute impossibility, which I do understand, we can't always keep our router near our sound system, you can always compromise by running an Ethernet out from an aftermarket Wi-Fi extender. Just make sure you keep it a little bit away from the stack. Like I stated before, the H400 is rated at 250 watts per channel into 8 ohms, and while Hegel don't specify a power rating themselves into 4 ohms, they do state that the amp is stable down to a 2 ohm load, meaning that this integrated amplifier should be comfortable with the most difficult to drive speakers in its price class. The amplifier section, which includes the Sound Engine 2, is dual mono, and it's a direct carryover from the H390, the same amplifier section from the previous model. The DAC in the H400 is a new chipset, and it's trickled down from the brand new H600. It's an ESS chip which employs Hegel's bit-perfect topology. It's capable of up to PCM 32384 and DSD 256. However, that full resolution is limited by your connection choice, and the only digital input capable of those specs is the USB connection. If your device is putting out a standard SPDIF connection, you're going to have to live with the mortals at a mere 192.24 for the coax and 96.24 for the optical. Largely, the H400 has the same features as the outgoing 390, with one minor new change being the introduction of Hegel's proprietary streaming app called Hegel Control. This app adds some additional functionality such as direct control of the amplifier, internet radio and podcast streaming, and Google Cast integration. It's pretty much bare bones, but it may expand in features over the course of its lifespan. Otherwise, we have pretty much the same functionality as before. The H400 is Roon Ready certified, meaning that if you have a Roon subscription and a Roon core, the H400 will operate pretty seamlessly as a Roon endpoint, and you can stay comfortably in your familiar digital ecosystem. For those of us not on the Roon train, there are a number of streaming options for you to choose from. The best option would likely be a UPnP app, which will allow integration of streaming services like Qobuz and Tidal in the most direct way possible. If that sounds too complicated for you, or you want to have another app, you can stream using features like Apple AirPlay at up to CD quality if you have an Apple device, or over Google Cast Audio at up to 96.24. Those that stream using Tidal or Spotify will have an easier time because you can use the direct features of those apps, but if you're buying a $7,000 integrated amplifier, do you really want to stream Spotify? Now, I talked a bit about the trickle-down DAC and streaming technology new in this model, but I forgot to mention that Hegel have redesigned the preamplifier section from this outgoing model as well. In theory, this means that while the amplifier of the H400 is the same Hegel I've known and lived with for a while now, the front end, meaning the streamer, DAC, and preamp, are completely new. The question for this reviewer is, how much of an improvement is there? Over the years and after listening to many models, I've developed a taste and appreciation for what I consider to be the Hegel sound signature. I find their amplifier designs to be both neutral and crowd-pleasing. They avoid harshness in the upper registers while still managing to do a lot of detail-oriented feats such as instrumental separation and very black backgrounds. By far, however, the biggest characteristic I've noticed throughout their range has been their bass authority and control. This is due largely to the high damping factor of their designs. In this amplifier, it's around 4,000. This in turn means precise driver control. High damping factor, when implemented well, is what gets you that tight, articulate, and punchy bass that every audiophile goes crazy for. Well, after listening to the H400 for the last month, I'm pleased to report they haven't destroyed their winning formula like Coca-Cola did in the 1980s. But there are some sonic changes, and I'll try to cover those while also describing the overall sound of this all-in-one amplifier to those that are not already on board with the Norwegian black box mafia. I spent a bit of time listening to my reference Harbeth 30.2 XD monitors on the H400, but early on in the review, I swapped them out for the recently reviewed Rido X2T 2.5-way floor standards that presented, I think, a more thorough test of the H400's ability to drive more complex loads. I spent a great deal of time listening to recordings I was quite familiar with on the H390 earlier, particularly vinyl records into one of the unit's line-level RCA inputs. Doing this allowed me to isolate the upgrades made to the preamplifier section before we even get to the DAC and the streamer. One of the first recordings I sat down and really took notes with was this 45 RPM Analog Productions pressing of South African trumpeter Hugh Masekela's live album Hope. This whole album is an audiophile delight, but sides 3 and 4 are long-time test record examples for me. Some familiar songs the H400 was singing to me was the tight, tuneful, and percussive bass control. That's there, thankfully. The noise floor was also delightfully low, as I've come to expect from Hegel products. This allows the instruments to appear with a greater space around them and helps distinguish low-level dynamic passages. I did start to note, however, that both macro and micro dynamics were more apparent than I was used to on the H400. With the track Lady on side 3, I heard much more forceful dynamic swings than I was typically used to. This came out both in the kit of the drummer and the many auxiliary percussion instruments backing Masakela's band. This track likes to simmer gently, and then all of a sudden, one of the instruments will really come out of the texture and explode with energy, often initiated by rim shots or drum fills. And how much those moments make you sit up and take notice is a great measure of how much power and control an amplifier is exerting over the speakers. On the side 4 track, Laguta, you get to pay more attention to the various vocal performances from Masakela's band, things like the primary singer and the backing chorus. This is where I began to notice how the H400 is different from the H390. There's definitely more upper register information happening on this recording with the 400 versus 390. This is brought out in all the subtle vocal inflections, particularly the consonant sounds, which deal with articulation, like the stops and starts of words. Everything is a bit more clear and unveiled, and it leads me to believe that the 400 is a little more detailed, especially in the mids and the treble, than its predecessor. This change is slight, but it's enough to infer a slightly different tonal balance. The 390 was often considered slightly warm sounding, especially compared to its big brother, the 590. I think this new preamp section, Hegel have more closely matched the 400 to the sound of previously the 590 and possibly the 600 model, although the 600 is one I haven't yet heard for myself. Before jumping into the digital side of the H400, I played one more record, and that was a vintage Mercury Living Presence recording released in 1960 with the Eastman Wind Ensemble titled Diverse Winds. This is one of the best sounding Mercury recordings I own in my collection, and it's a fantastic record for tone color because the Eastman winds are rendered in this beautiful sound that highlights the individual timbres of the different instruments. My favorite piece on this album is one I wasn't actually familiar with before owning this record, and that's the Concerto for 23 Wind Instruments by American composer Walter Hartley. This piece was written for Fennell and the Eastman Wind Ensemble in 1958, and this recording right here is the recorded premiere of the piece. This composition treats each section of woodwinds and brass instruments like soloists and weaves virtuosic lines of counterpoint throughout the ensemble. This recording through the H400 captures the palpable and physical sound of each of these instruments. The articulation of the brass players, particularly the trombone, is heard beyond just the tone of the instrument, but you also hear the starts and the stops of notes, especially the brief tongue thwack in the mouthpiece before the sound emerges from the bell. Likewise, reed sounds are transparent, from Bob Sprenkel's signature wide vibrato on the oboe to the reediness of the bass clarinet, that has that whoosh of resonance that is so essential to the absolute sound of hearing the instrument live. It wouldn't be a Mercury recording without dynamics, and the Hegel delivers in spades across the frequency spectrum. The dynamic surges of these instruments are felt clearly in both intimate settings and when the band is kind of at its full force. The microdynamics, the piece of the puzzle essential to expressing the musicality of all the players on the recording, those are all in place here. The inky black backgrounds we've come to know from this brand of integrated amplifiers helps a ton with that feature, as well as placing space around the musicians. The H400 is better at this feat than its predecessor, and it took a recording like this vintage Mercury here to help me distinguish that difference. The Hegel is not just a mere integrated though, and a lot of its appeal comes from its onboard DAC and Streamer, which are not billed as afterthoughts. I spent time listening to both elements in tandem as well as with the DAC alone. One of my go-to digital recordings now on Qobuz is the excellent soundtrack from the old film Hatari by Henry Mancini. Streamed 9624 via Google Cast, this recording portrayed a rich and sweeping sound with organic clarity. The various instruments used in the opening overtures, such as hand drums and various cymbals, are not thrown in your face. And that's sometimes the case with very hyper-detailed presentations, but rather on the Hegel, they are kind of just unveiled with this organic clarity. I compared the presentation of this track using my reference streamer, the Inuos Zenith Mark III, connected via USB to the Hegel DAC. This is very much not a fair comparison. The Zenith Mark III alone is pretty much the same price as the H400, but what it allowed me to do is hear some of the inherent compromises of an integrated streamer design like this. The EOS was able to provide much more dynamic headroom, allowing Mancini's orchestra to swell and recede more fully. The background was also blacker. There was much less noise and silence for the instruments to emerge from on a stark canvas. If you're running Roon, however, which is not something I did a couple years ago, my guess is that the performance gulf is going to be narrowed somewhat by audio-optimized Roon software. I did some more streaming on Qobuz with 2 more albums. The first was Jimmy Eat World's 1999 creative high watermark, Clarity. This album is from that rare period in music where major labels were signing big checks to indie rock bands, and Jimmy Eat World has a lot of high-end production to play with here. This is apparent from the opening track, Table for Glasses, where just the snare sound alone was haunting as it kind of just reverberated throughout the whole of my listening room. I really got a sense of how massive and expansive the sound of the band was streaming to the H400, hooked up to the Rex 2Ts. All of the overdub strings in the bridge to the chorus had space around them and texture in spades. There's something special about hearing one of your favorite songs expanded in this massive and open stage. It's kind of like the feeling of finally seeing one of your favorite movies on the big screen after watching it on like DVD or VHS all your life. I won't linger too long on this album, but I wanted to also highlight the second track, Lucky Denver Mint, where the Hegel really solidified the driving and moving rhythm of this song. Some equipment I've listened to with this tune can give this tune kind of this laid-back quality, but really what it needs is rhythmic punch to move it forward, which I certainly heard here. What's a new sensation, though, is upper register detail and refinement, particularly in the timbre of instruments like cymbals and the differentiation of the different sounds of the different cymbals. I think the upgrades Hegel have done here create a far better sense of refinement in this area of the frequency spectrum than its predecessor, the H390. One final listening example comes from an underappreciated new wave classic from the other side of the Pacific, and I'm talking about the album Poison by the 1980s Japanese band Rebecca. This album takes a lot of influence from American and British new wavers like Cyndi Lauper and Roxy Music, but they have their own unique sound signature highlighted by the distinctive vocals of their singer Noko. On this album, there are a lot of both analog and digital synths and synth pads. The lead single, Moon, I think represents a really great test of how an amplifier and a DAC can handle all these kind of very 80s instruments in an organic way. This song can sound lush and vibrant with a wide soundstage for all the effects to layer, or it can sound kind of tinny and harsh. A lot of this depends on the presentation of the electronics you're listening through. The pretty much neutral sound of the H400 is definitely a benefit here because it really fleshes out those electronic instruments rather than kind of squashing them and shoving them in your face. The gentle but extended upper register of this amp helps us a great deal because an amp that has a slightly more boosted or etched upper frequency would have a hard time portraying this information to the listener in a manner that can be enjoyable. The other track on this album that I come back to over and over again is the next song, which is Manatsu no Ame, which roughly translates in English to Midsummer Rain. This song has a laid-back, kind of reggae-inspired rhythm that reminds me a lot of a ballad by The Police. Except here, the drums and guitars are drenched in this like really thick wash of reverb that makes the soundstage feel larger than life when you play it through a really competent, powerful amplifier like the Hegel. It really feels like the band is playing on a huge arena stage and you, the audience member, this small audience member in this huge crowd are just soaking in this lush sound. When your system is balanced right, this track should feel both expansive and engrossed in color, but also punchy, particularly in the low end. Striking that balance can be hard, but the authoritative bass response of the H400 helps accomplish this goal. During the end of my time with the H400, I spent some time swapping in my reference DAC, the Denefrips Pontus 2, and I did this through the DAC loop function on the Hegel, which allows you to use the Hegel Streamer while going through your own DAC. The H400 DAC is an impressive and balanced digital converter, and I think it can hold its own. But if you step up to something like the Denefrips, it does reveal a more liquid and organic presentation. On the Rebecca album, the synths felt juicy and punchy through the H400 DAC. It was a great sound. But when I played the same album on the DAC loop to my Denefrips Pontus 2, those same synths, they were candy rich with much greater abundance of texture. All the instruments sounded thicker and bigger. Last, the final experiment I did, which was just for fun and because I had a new toy, I experimented a bit with the pre-out functionality of the H400. This is because during the review period, I actually ended up purchasing a gently used power amplifier, the recently discontinued Hegel H30. This is over 100 pound beast of a stereo amplifier, and when it was new, it was recently discontinued about 2 years ago. When it was new, it retailed for US $15,000. Despite that, the preamp gain feature of the H400, even though it was RCA unbalanced, was able to easily mate with the H30 amplifier, and I had a fun, if not somewhat underproductive time listening to the slightly price points mismatched combination. What you do get when you swap the amplifier section of the H400 out for Hegel's top-of-the-line design, the sound signature isn't actually drastically different. But if I had to sum it up into a single statement, it would be a greater sense of ease. Not to say the bigger amplifier made anything sound relaxed, but rather it was like watching two weightlifters deadlift the same weight. Both accomplish the task, but one does it with great effort and concentration. It's difficult for them, while the other is so skilled that the act looks casual in nature. The H30 exhibited far greater authority of both the riders and the harbets, all while sounding less anxious and more open and rich and organic. A big change was the mid-range and how just lush and tube-like it got. It's surprising to hear from a solid-state amplifier. So what does that experiment mean? Well, the preamp outs in this integrated work as intended, and if you really wanted to, I guess you could pair the H400 with your super amplifier of choice. Otherwise, I don't really know what the point of the exercise was, but I had fun doing it. Circling back to reality and the target market of this amp, I'll say that the combination of a powerful and refined integrated amplifier with onboard high-resolution DAC and Streamer is a great value proposition at $7,000 MSRP. You definitely can upgrade the digital components as you like, but getting any meaningful performance boost is going to come at a substantial cost and kind of defeats the point of an all-in-one. I think the onboard Streamer easily competes with your under $1,000 options, standalone options such as the iFi Zen or the Blue Sound Node. I don't think those are going to be significant steps up, and to beat it, you're going to have to go up to something like the Inuos Zen Mini. You could probably say the same thing about the onboard DAC, which is really satisfying at its price point and a large improvement over previous DACs and Hegel amplifiers. I do have to note the H400 occupies a unique position in the market compared to a lot of other integrated amplifiers because I think this is first and foremost a unit that emphasizes its analog components. Yeah, there is a lot of digital connectivity on the H400, but it will operate with really astounding performance purely as an analog device. In my opinion, this is a contrast to a lot of other digital all-in-one integrated options in the market in the same price range. For instance, earlier this year I reviewed the Name Unity Nova PE, which is very obviously designed to be primarily a streaming amplifier. That amplifier converts all of its analog inputs to CD quality digital. This is also kind of true for another competitor, the NAD M66, which is a competitor for both the Name and the Hegel, but on the NAD, the digital conversion that is kind of automatic on the amplifier, it is actually defeatable. Still, I would say that amplifier also emphasizes the digital first side of its connectivity. Throughout my time with the H400 and in many years with its predecessor, the H390, I never thought of these amplifiers as digital amplifiers. And I was just as happy spinning records and hooking up my own DACs to the amp as I was using the onboard Streamer and treating the unit as a one-box solution. What I will say is that as much as the digital connectivity is a benefit and comprehensive solution for playback with the H400, I want to warn you against discounting this amplifier from consideration because of these digital features, because its analog signal chain is very impressive in its own right and competes athletically with much more kind of purist integrated amplifiers out there. The H400 is a lot of amplifier for the money, and I think it's a worthy successor to one of the most popular integrated amps of the last decade. It will drive virtually any speaker on the market, in a reasonable price point, and it's going to impart a very crowd-pleasing yet fairly neutral sound signature while doing so. You could easily treat this amplifier as the only box you need, or you can pair it with any number of add-on components, and I think you'd still be getting a great value. I think if you're in the market for any type of integrated amp in the $5,000 to $10,000 US range, this is a unit you should really demo, because if the sound is up your alley, there's not a lot of faults you can find in this unassuming Norwegian design. But those are just my thoughts. We would love to hear yours. Please tell us what you think down in the comment section below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so that our reviews and hi-fi videos show up right in your feed. Thanks for watching, and until next time.